Okay, so I will begin by giving a brief introduction to what I'll be covering just in the next 40 minutes or so. So the indicator report provides an update on the extent to which 5 specific rights are being protected in York: the right to a decent standard of living, the right to housing, the right to health and to decent social care, the right to education, and the right to equality and non-discrimination. With each right we look to 2 or 3 indicators in order to get a sense of the progress being made regarding the protection of the right. Most of the information for the indicators comes from the York Open Data website, but I will also use info from civil society organizations in York and elsewhere, and data from national statistical sources. My hope is that the information presented can provide a basis for our later discussion about the protection of human rights in York. Obviously, the topic which has dominated headlines in the past year has been the ongoing cost of living crisis. Unfortunately, due to the nature of statistical reporting, the latest data we have for many of the indicators was released last spring, and therefore doesn't fully capture what's been happening in the last 9 months or so. As a result, a lot of the data provided will tell a story about how York performed in the post-pandemic period, but not about the impact of the cost of living crisis. To remedy this, I have tried, where possible, to bring in other information sources which give a better sense of what has been happening since the cost of living crisis has really taken hold. In that vein, I will begin by providing some data about how the cost of living crisis is impacting the residents of York. So this info is taken from a report by the Centre for Cities think tank called Out of Pocket: The Places at the Sharp End of the Cost of Living Crisis, and from their cost of living tracker. So what the Centre for Cities has tried to do is to calculate how real wages have been impacted by the cost of living crisis in towns and cities in the UK. Real wages means wage levels after inflation has been taken into account. They are calculated by comparing the rise in the price of goods and services in a certain period to the growth in wage levels in the same period. The greater the difference between rising costs and wage growth, the bigger the impact on real wages. What's interesting about the Centre for Cities data is that when examining levels of inflation in the UK, they have estimated localized inflation rates for different towns and cities. They do this by looking at the different consumption rates in these areas. If a city consumes a large amount of a particular good that has been impacted by rising prices, this will be reflected in its bespoke rate of inflation. The think tank found that the biggest driver of variations between the inflation rates of different cities are energy costs and petrol costs. With energy costs, they found that towns and cities with large amounts of energy inefficient housing stock are being impacted more severely by price rises in the energy sector, because their citizens are, on average, having to spend more to heat their homes than citizens in areas with energy efficient housing. Similarly, towns and cities in which residents use their cars more often and to travel larger distances are more severely impacted by the rise in petrol prices than other urban areas. This is obviously affected by availability and reliability of public transport, by the provision of services locally, and by the availability of employment in the locality. So as of October of this year, of the 62 towns and cities examined, London had the lowest inflation rate at 10.2%. Burnley performed the worst with an inflation rate of 13%. And generally, the towns worst hit by inflation were in the north of the country. York fared comparatively well. It had the 14th lowest inflation rate at 11.4%, similar to Brighton, Bristol, Southampton, and Newcastle. The Centre for Studies estimates that York's inflation rate rose by 5.8 percentage points between January and October of this year. This rise in inflation was compounded by wage stagnation in York. The Centre for Cities estimates that between April 21 and 22, average wages in York grew by only 1.5%, one of the worst rates of the cities included in the survey. They estimate that wage levels actually reduced between January 22 and July 22 by 0.2%. meaning that workers living in York were on average £121 a month per in July 22 than they were in the previous year. So hopefully that gives some sense of the economic impact of the cost of living crisis in York. I'll now move on to the first of our rights, which is the right to a decent standard of living. So we use three indicators to measure the protection of this right. First, we look at levels of child poverty in York. Secondly, we examine food bank use in the city. And finally, we look at the income gap between those on median earnings and those on low earnings. Child poverty is measured by looking at the number or proportion of children living in families whose reported income is less than 60% of the UK median. This graph shows the proportion of children in York living in poverty. The information is taken from the York Open Data website, which currently only provides statistics for child poverty for the 2020-21 financial year. This therefore doesn't cover the post-pandemic period, nor does it capture the impact of the cost of living crisis. It's reported that in 2021, 12.9% of children in York were living in poverty. This number is essentially the same as the previous year, which was 13%, and is 1% higher than 2018-2019, which was at 11.9%. The next graph represents statistics taken from the End Child Poverty Coalition. They also only go as far as 2020-21, but unlike the York Open Data statistics, they take account of housing costs when calculating levels of child poverty. They report that in 2020-21, there were 7,443 children living in poverty in York. That was 23.3% of all children in the city. That's similar to the previous year, which saw 7,842 children living in poverty, or 23.9%, and is 2% higher than the figure of 2018-19, when 6,909 children in York were living in poverty. In 2020-21, 25.3% of children in York Central were living in poverty, down 1.1% from the previous year, whilst 15.4% of children in York Outer were living in poverty, down 2.1% from the previous year. Moving forward to this year, the Child Poverty Action Group has reported that 2022 has seen by far the biggest deterioration in families' living standards in the UK since their Cost of a Child report began 10 years ago. This, they say, is due to the fact that incomes have failed to keep up with rising costs, and therefore the real income of families has fallen. According to the report, for those not in work, the benefits freeze has been causing a gradual widening of the gap between income and costs. However, the past year has seen a dramatic increase in this gap due to the ending of the universal credit uplift and due to the failure of benefits to keep pace with inflation. Benefits now cover less than half of what a family with 2 children requires in 2022. This is down from about 2/3 in 2012. The report states that even working families cannot count on having enough income to meet minimum needs. For example, a family with both parents working full-time on the minimum wage will fall short of meeting their needs by about 6%. For a lone parent, even a median wage is now not enough as they will fall 12% short. With both of these examples, the families would have been able to cover costs in 2021. Moving on now to our next indicator, which is the right, which is food bank use. So usually we do have fairly up-to-date numbers in terms of food bank use in York. However, unfortunately, I haven't yet been able to get the data, the most recent data from the Trussell Trust, which runs the largest food bank in York. We do know that as early as May of this year, the Trust Food Bank in York was reporting a 30% increase in referrals since the end of 2021. In Yorkshire and the Humber, the Trust distributed 156,000 three-day emergency food parcels between April 1st, 2021 and the 31st of March 22. At a national level, 2.2 million such parcels were delivered in that period, the most on record outside of the pandemic. By comparison, in 2016-17, the Trust distributed around 1.2 million packages. In August, the Independent Food Network UK announced that nearly 90% of the food banks in their network were experiencing higher demand, and that over half of their food banks were reporting that 25% or more of the people they were now supporting hadn't previously used their services. The network also noted that food banks were experiencing a drop in donations and were having supply issues. So some of our students in the University of York have been looking at the issue of food bank use over the past few weeks, and have interviewed a number of key stakeholders in the city. And I'd just like to mention some of the issues that they've come across. The first thing that they noted is the stigma attached to food poverty and to using food banks. Some of the stakeholders interviewed noted the difficulty that people have in talking about the fact that they're struggling financially. This is especially true of older people and of people who have not previously experienced poverty. To counter this, a number of food banks are trying to offer food discreetly. Another way of reducing stigma is to locate food banks in places that have the feel of a regular cafe so that people feel more comfortable in using them. However, a number of stakeholders also talked about the need to encourage a more open and honest discussion about food poverty and poverty in general in the city. Another issue that our students identified is that food banks, as well as providing food for those in need, have also functioned as social spaces. Some of the stakeholders noted that food bank users often talked about experiencing loneliness and see the food bank as a place in which they can socialize and find company. Finally, the students noted the rise in informal food shares in York. These operate in a non-referral, community-based model where people are encouraged to take what they need or pay what they feel. And I know that the council have been trying to get a sense of the extent of these networks and have been mapping the location of informal food shares around the city. So hopefully this will give us a better sense of the extent to which people are using food banks in York. I'd also like to mention the Priority Places for Food Index. So this has been created by researchers at the Consumer Data Research Centre at the University of Leeds in conjunction with the consumer organisation Which. So the index aims to identify neighbourhoods in the United Kingdom that are most vulnerable to increases in the cost of living, and specifically which have a lack of accessibility to affordable, healthy and sustainable sources of food. So the index uses a number of variables to calculate vulnerability, including income deprivation, car access, levels of fuel poverty, and proximity to supermarket retail facilities. There were no areas in York identified as being in the top 10% of the most vulnerable areas in the UK. However, the index does identify parts of New Yearswick, Clifton Moor, and Huntington as being in the top 20% of areas which have a lack of accessibility to cheap and healthy food. So you can find a heat map of vulnerable areas and information about the index on the Leeds University Consumer Data Research Centre website. So the final indicator which we consider for the right to a decent standard of living is the earnings gap, which is the difference in weekly wages between those earning mean wages or average wages and those on low wages, defined as those in the 25th percentile. Last year, these statistics were taken from the York Open Data report on the annual survey of hours and earnings, which is yet to be published this year. I therefore have gone directly to the survey itself, which is published by the Office for National Statistics. And the average weekly wage in York is £725. We see from the graph that this is an increase of 5.9% since 2020. However, we can also see, as I mentioned before, that wage levels in York have stagnated in the past year. The average weekly wage in York is higher than for Yorkshire and the Humber as a whole, where the average is £677, but is below the average for England, which is £766, and for the UK, where the average is £755. If we turn to the earnings gap, again, this is defined as the disparity between those on average weekly wages and those on low wages. In York, in 2022, it is £269. Last year, it was £282. So since 2020 now, the gap has decreased in York by 1.9%. This is similar to trends in Yorkshire and the Humber, England and the UK, where decreases have also been seen over the past number of years. So the second right we consider is the right to housing. We consider its protection by assessing the performance of three indicators, all related to homelessness. The first is the amount of people assessed for statutory homelessness in a 12-month period and those deemed to be owed a duty by the council. The second is the number of people found to be sleeping rough on a particular night of the year. And the third indicator is the number of people living in temporary accommodation in York. So I'm still waiting for clarification on the numbers regarding rough sleeping and those living in temporary accommodation. Therefore, I'm going to focus on the statistics regarding statutory homelessness. Also, although it isn't an indicator we use, I'm going to talk briefly about some of the data we have relating to the private rental sector. So looking first at statutory homelessness. So when someone is assessed for homelessness, there are three possible outcomes. First, the person may be assessed as being homeless. In that case, the local authority is deemed to have what's called a relief duty towards the person. Alternatively, the person may be assessed as being at risk of homelessness. In that case, the local authority is deemed to have a prevention duty. And finally, a person may be assessed as not being at risk of homelessness, in which case the local authority is deemed not to have a statutory duty towards that person. After a reduction in the number of those being assessed for homelessness between 2019-20 and 2020-21, from 899 down to 814, the number is unchanged for this past financial year, with 814 people again being assessed in the period between April 21 and April 22. Considering the statistics for the last 3 financial years for York, the proportion of those assessed for homelessness who have subsequently been deemed to be owed a duty by the council is very high, usually around 98%. Of those owed a duty, the majority are usually assessed as being owed a prevention duty. That is, they're deemed to be at risk of homelessness. In 2021-22, 69.3 of those assessed were deemed to be owed a prevention duty. 30.7% of those assessed were deemed to be owed a relief duty, meaning that they're homeless at the time of assessment. So as the statistics for the 2021-22 financial year only bring us up until the end of March, they're unable to capture the impact of the cost of living crisis. I therefore also looked at a data set for the first 6 months of 22 to see if there are any noticeable trends. So there were 585 people assessed for homelessness in York from January 1st to January 30th of this year. For the same period in the previous year, there were 420 people assessed for homelessness. So that's a 39.3% increase. So a substantial increase in the numbers being assessed for homelessness. However, what stands out most from the comparison between the two periods is that despite the rise in total numbers assessed in the first half of 22, the number of people deemed to be owed either a prevention or a relief duty was actually lower in the first 6 months of 2022 than it had been in the same period in 2021, from 415 down to 401. Correspondingly, the amount of people assessed as not being owed any duty by the local authority was a massive 184 in the first 6 months of 2022, compared with only 5 in the same period in 2021. And if you look closer, it becomes clear that almost all of the assessments that resulted in no duty being owed in the second happened in the second quarter of 2022, between April 1st and June 30th. In that period, 182 people were assessed as having no duty owed to them by the local authority. To highlight the significance of this number, if we look back at the number of people who were assessed as not being owed any duty by York Council in the past 3 financial years, that total amount over those 3 years combined was only 38. Indeed, the number assessed who were deemed not to be owed a duty in York was the highest of any local authority in the country in the second quarter of 2022. So I'm not sure why that number was so high in the second quarter of this year. And if anyone watching has any idea why this might be the case, it would be great to hear from you in the discussion after the presentation. I would also like to talk briefly, as I mentioned, about the private rental sector. We know that the loss of a tenancy in the private rental sector is the leading cause of homelessness in England. So private rents in York are traditionally quite high and have continued to rise in 2022. Data from the Office for National Statistics shows that from April 21 until April 22, the median monthly rental price for a room in a shared house in York was £460. This is higher than for Yorkshire and Humber, which is £375, and England as a whole, which was £425. The monthly rental price for a two-bedroom house or apartment in York was £795, again higher from the Yorkshire and Humber and for England. If we compare these numbers with the previous year, we can see there's been an 8.2% increase in the price of a shared room in York and a 3.9% increase for a two-bedroom apartment. We know that a lot of private renters in York are low paid and are dependent on benefits to meet their housing costs. In February, the Citizens Advice Bureau stated that high rental prices in York mean that if you're on benefits, it is becoming increasingly difficult to rent a home privately in the city, as housing allowances are too low. Taken together, rising rents, low wages, inadequate benefits, and the general rise in costs mean that many private renters in York will be facing significant pressures this winter, and some will struggle to pay their rent. I don't have York specific numbers, but we do know that since the lifting of the moratorium on evictions in England and Wales, the number of evictions has risen dramatically. According to Ministry for Justice figures from July 22 to September 22, there were 21,000 landlord repossession claims in England and Wales. That's a 106% increase on the same quarter in the previous year and a 16% increase on the period from April to June 2022. According to the homelessness charity Crisis, unless government policy changes, particularly in relation to housing benefit levels, over 300,000 individuals and families across Britain could be forced into homelessness in 2023. This is up from 227,000 in 2020, so an increase of 32%. So to move on to health and social care, we use two indicators with respect to this. First, we look at the proportion of service users who have as much social contact as they would like. And secondly, we look at life expectancy and healthy life expectancy in York. So in last year's report, we noted the significant drop in the number of service users who had as much social contact as they would like. Only 35.4% reported that they had sufficient social contact in 2020-21, compared to 45.5% in 2019-2020. This, of course, was impacted by the pandemic, but also by the crisis in the care sector. In 2021-22, we see there's been a recovery of sorts, with 39.7% of service users stating that they had as much social contact as they would like. However, this number is still over 5% lower than that reported in 2019-2020. The most recent life expectancy and healthy life expectancies numbers we have access to are taken from March 2021. So each of the indicators have seen a decrease compared to the previous year. The life expectancy for men was 79.9 years, down from 80.2 years. Life expectancy for women was down to 83.6 years, compared to 83.7 years in 2019-2020. Healthy life expectancy is defined as the average number of years that an individual is expected to live in a state of self-assessed good or very good health. Here again, we see decreases. So healthy life expectancy for men was at 65.3, down from 65.8. And healthy life expectancy for women also saw a decrease, down from 66.4 to 64.6. So almost a 2-year decrease. Earlier in the year, the Institute for Fiscal Studies published a report on health inequalities in the UK, and they're linked to life expectancy. And I'd just like to highlight some of the main points here. So the most notable point made in the report is the general slowdown in progress in terms of life expectancy for men and women in the UK since 2010. So as of 2019, the UK ranked 24th in the OECD in life expectancy, behind nearly all countries in Western Europe. Prior to 2010, the main driver for improving life expectancy in the UK was the advance in the treatment of cardiovascular disease. These advances also explain the narrowing gap between men and women in terms of life expectancy over the past 50 years, as men die from cardiovascular disease at much higher rates than women. It seems that a slowdown in the progress against this disease has been accompanied by a slowing in the rate of improvement in terms of life expectancy in the UK. The report also highlighted regional disparities in terms of life expectancy. Prior to the pandemic, those born in London and the South East had a life expectancy of over 2 years higher than those born in the north of England. Life expectancy gains faltered for men and women in the north of England after 2012, but continue to improve for those born in London. The authors of the report noted the significant link between levels of education and rates of mortality. They also noted that mortality rates are higher in more deprived places. Generally speaking, those in poor health have less education and are on lower incomes. Interestingly, a study by Cookson from 2015, which was mentioned in the report, found that the largest and most systemic differences between rich and poor in terms of healthcare was to be found in preventive procedures, particularly in relation to cancer, with those on higher incomes more likely to access such services. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the report notes that the most promising approach to improving the health of the population is to focus on the health and well-being of children. Good childhood health is linked to better developmental and educational outcomes. This is linked to higher earnings in later life, which is self-linked to better health outcomes. The next right the indicator the report will consider is the right, the next right the indicator report will consider is the right to education. This is again measured using two indicators. The first is the proportion of 16 to 17-year-olds in York who are not in education, employment, or training. And the second is the proportion of primary school children who are achieving the expected standard in reading, writing, and maths at the end of primary school. We use this indicator to determine the attainment gap, that is the disparity between disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged students in terms of achieving the requisite educational standards. Looking at the number of 16 to 17-year-olds not in education, employment, or training, we can see it has continued to decrease in the past year. In 2018-2019 period, 2.7% of 16 to 17-year-olds were not in education, employment, or training. This is reduced to 2.4% in 2019-2020 and to 1.9% in 2020-21. For the 21-22 period, which ended in March of this year, the number had dropped to 1.1%, and by September of this year, it had reached 0.4%. This decrease has been accompanied by a general reduction in employment in York since the COVID-19 pandemic. In a quarterly economic update presented to the City Council in May of this year, it was reported that the number of people claiming out-of-work benefits had decreased for 12 consecutive months, from February 2021 to February 22. According to the Centre for Cities, by October of 2022, the unemployment rate in York had dropped to 1.7% of the working age population, and this is significantly below the national average of 3.6%. Further, it was reported that youth unemployment was at 1.2%, whilst the national average was 3.7%. Overall, therefore, York has fared comparatively well in terms of cutting unemployment. However, as the country is expected to enter into recession at the end of this year, we would expect that the city will see a rise in unemployment in 2023. Unfortunately, we don't yet have data on the attainment gap for 2022. This data wasn't collected in 2019-20 or in 2020-21 due to the pandemic. And I've been informed that the data has been collected for this year, but it's not yet been published. However, the importance of continuing to explore methods through which the disadvantage gap may be narrowed has been highlighted in this journal article written by researchers in the University of York, which was published this year. The research analysed previous studies which have looked at the relationship between children's performance in primary education and their socioeconomic status and the socioeconomic status of their family. Alarmingly, the researchers found that the link between family socioeconomic status and children's primary school performance has remained relatively constant over the past 95 years in Britain. This suggests that efforts to narrow the attainment gap between those who come from privileged backgrounds and those who come from disadvantaged backgrounds has been largely unsuccessful. The researchers advanced the theory that this failure is a result of policies which have focused too narrowly on providing equality of opportunity in education, defined as a system in which all children enjoy the same learning opportunities. They are taught the same curricula at the same pace by the same methods, regardless of their difference in ability, skills, and interests. This approach, they argue, fails to account for the fact that those from disadvantaged backgrounds are often unable to take advantage of educational opportunities to the same extent that their peers are. Instead, educational policy, they argue, should be focused on what they call equity in education. That is, on reducing children's difference in educational outcomes by distributing education resources in ways that level the playing fields for all children, tailoring educational provisions to students' individual characteristics and needs. One example of such approach is the Early Talk for York programme. This programme was launched in response to a Department of Education report in 2017, which revealed that only 46% of disadvantaged children in York were reaching a good level of development, well below the national average. The report identified early language and literary skills as a key area for improvement. The programme, which began with a pilot project in 2019, is designed to help improve the speech, communication, and language of children aged from 0 to 5 years, as these skills are linked with positive outcomes in later life. The approach involves training childminders and staff in early year settings in primary schools and how to assess the speech and language skills of young children so that they can identify any issues. Professionals such as speech therapists are then brought in order to address any issues which have been identified. In the Council's pilot project, it emerged that children who were part of the programme showed significant improvements in their speech and communication skills compared to those who did not receive comparable support. As a result, a citywide rollout of the programme was approved by the Council in November of this year. It's been reported that since the initial introduction of the programme, the gap between non-disadvantaged children nationally and disadvantaged children who have been part of the programme in York has reduced from 34.5% to 2.5%. So the success of this initiative, which focuses resources on those children with the greatest learning needs, could help point the way for future educational policies in the city and may help to narrow the attainment gap between children from different socioeconomic backgrounds. So to move on to our final right, that is equality and non-discrimination. The protection of this right is measured by two indicators. First is the number of hate crimes recorded in the preceding year. And second is the pay gap between working men and women in York. So according to the North Yorkshire Police, this year saw a slight reduction in the number of hate crimes recorded. In the period from 31st of October 21 until the 31st of October 22, there were 354 hate crimes recorded. That's down from 402 in the previous 12-month period. The highest proportion of hate crimes were again race-related at 64.1%, followed by sexual orientation at 15.8%. In last year's report, we noted the link between the nighttime economy and hate crimes, And that relation can again be seen in this year's statistics, with 27.7% of hate crimes recorded taking place between 12 and 1 a.m. 24% of hate crimes recorded took place in the Guildhall inner area. Generally speaking, more incidents were recorded in the spring and summer than the autumn and winter, which again echoes the findings of last year's report. And one thing I'd just like to note before moving on is the high failure rate in terms of resolving hate crime incidents. So of the 354 incidents recorded, 195 are still under investigation. Of the 150 incidents which have been investigated, only 5 resulted in cautions and 8 were dealt with by community resolution. Over 78% had no resolution due to issues with obtaining evidence, with the identification of suspects being a particular problem. So overall, this year is the first time since the indicator reports were published where we have seen a reduction in hate crimes, which is to be welcomed. However, obviously the numbers are still very high, and in the majority of cases, it seems there is insufficient evidence to take action against the perpetrator. Moving on to the final indicator, which is the gender pay gap. So again, these figures are usually taken from York Open Data's report on the annual survey of hours and earnings. And again, as this hasn't been released yet, I've taken the statistics directly from the Office for National Statistics website. In last year's report, we highlighted the large increase in the gender pay gap in York, and we remarked that this increase was likely due to pandemic-related measures. However, if the hope was that the gap would start to reduce this year, disappointingly, it seems to have actually increased again. We've previously used 2 measures to indicate the gender pay gap. The first is median weekly wages of men and women in York, and the second is average hourly wages of men and women in the city. If we look first at weekly median wage, we see that for men in York, it is currently at £705. This is down from £717 in 21. And the weekly median wage for women in York is £552, down from £569 in 2021. This means that the gender pay gap has gone from £73 in 2020 to £147 in 2021 and to £162 in 2022. That 2022 number compares with a gap of £106 in Yorkshire and the Humber, £105 in England, and £98 in the UK as a whole. If we look then at average hourly earnings of men and women in York, we can see that in 2020, men in York earned 8.4% more than women. In 2021, this had risen to 18.8%. In 2022, men now earn 21.1% more than women in York. This compares with 10.4% in Yorkshire and the Humber, 9.3% in England, and 8.3% in the UK as a whole. And so we can see on this graph how pronounced the increase in the gender pay gap has been for York compared to Yorkshire and the Humber, England, and the UK. And the Office for National Statistics has warned that UK numbers are probably still somewhat distorted by the pandemic. So it may be too early to say whether the pay gap is trending in the wrong direction. However, the fact that York's gender pay gap is substantially larger than the national average is cause for concern. And so just to finish by recapping some of the positives and negatives from the report. The report this year, I think, will be a story of signs of post-pandemic recovery, but also warnings about the impact of the cost of living crisis. As I mentioned, many of the statistics we use for the report are gathered earlier in the year, and so don't capture what has been happening in more recent months. For this reason, it's difficult to sum up indicators in terms of clear positives and negatives, as the progress seen with many of the indicators earlier in the year has clearly been impacted by the cost of living crisis in more recent months. That said, it is clear that the proportion of 16 to 17-year-olds not in education, employment, or training has continued to decrease and is now at very low levels. This decrease took place within the context of good progress in terms of the post-pandemic employment rate, although this has been accompanied by evidence of wage stagnation in York. We've also seen a narrowing of the earnings gap, which is obviously to be welcomed. In terms of hate crimes, the number recorded is still very high, and there are clear problems in terms of providing justice for the victims. But it should be noted that this year did see the first decrease in numbers since the indicator reports have been published. In terms of the educational attainment gap, we'll have to wait for the updated data to be published. One would imagine that the pandemic impacted children from disadvantaged backgrounds to a greater extent than their peers. So it'll be interesting to see if this is shown up in the numbers. With housing, we're seeing some evidence of a rise in people presenting as homeless, and there's also evidence of growing insecurity in the private rental sector. Child poverty figures for York have shown slight improvement. However, the data is from 2021, and it is clear from national evidence that things have gotten much tougher for families in the past year. We are also waiting for the final numbers for food bank use in York this year, but it is again clear from national evidence that increasing numbers are facing food security. I noted that the gender pay gap increased again this year. As I mentioned, the Office for National Statistics has stated that the data is likely showing the impact of pandemic measures, but the size of the gender pay gap in York compared to national figures is clearly concerning. And finally, I also noted the decrease in life expectancy and healthy life expectancy. So that's the end of my presentation. I think we should have some time for discussion now.